Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. L'Arche is an international organization of faith-based communities creating homes and day programs with people who have developmental disabilities. In many ways, the organization is built on the recognition of the ability of individuals with developmental disabilities to welcome and accept others as they are. It's a gift that has an important and transformative effect, helping to humanize our entire society. With me in studio today to tell us about this innovative organization is Carl MacMillan, Community Leader of L'Arche Daybreak. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So why don't we start by just discussing what is L'Arche?
Sure. Well, maybe the first thing to say is something about the word, because L'Arche is not an English word, it's a French word. And L'Arche means the Ark, like Noah's Ark or the Ark of the Covenant. So it does come from a religious, biblical tradition. And L'Arche was started by a Canadian in France. And many people know Jean Vanier. Jean Vanier is the son of George Vanier, who was Governor General of Canada in the middle part of the 20th century. And Jean is now an old man. He's about 77 years old. But back in 1964, he had what was then quite a radical idea of inviting two men who lived in an institution. These two men were Raphael and Felipe, both men with intellectual disabilities. And he invited them to live with him in a little house, and they called their house L'Arche. And it started really as a very little idea. Jean was a man who loved to travel. He never saw L'Arche as getting any bigger than the number of people who would fit in a car. But he was and is a very dynamic man, and quickly L'Arche in this little town in France, Trolley-Broye, grew to another couple of houses, and in 1969 a Canadian couple, took that idea of this little L'Arche community where people live together in community back to Canada. And they founded what they called Daybreak, which is just north of Toronto and Richmond Hill. And that became the first L'Arche community in North America. And today there are 28 L'Arche communities in Canada and about 130 worldwide.
Wow. And are these communities, generally speaking, autonomous from each other in that they each decide how the community is run and how things are sort of organized? Or is there a sort of federation, as it were, of the different communities?
Well, there is certainly a federation, and each community does have its own community life, its own community structures, but belonging, of course, is very central to what L'Arche is about. So each community belongs to a region. Here in Ontario, we have 9 different communities, so we're the Ontario region. And in Canada, there are 4 different regions which comprise a zone. And in the world, there are 8 zones. So belonging in many different ways, locally, regionally, internationally, is all part of the L'Arche story.
Now, tell me a bit more about, I guess, the relationships that exist within a L'Arche community. And perhaps I'll venture and use the word egalitarian, that there's almost really a different restructuring than how the world tends to regard ability, that really within the L'Arche community, a lot of that's discarded to really get to the root of community and of people, as you say, belonging to each other and belonging to a larger group.
Well, you're hitting on something very central to what L'Arche is about, this whole idea of mutuality and in living together in mutually respectful and mutually transforming relationships. So often the person with intellectual disability is seen as someone who needs to be cared for. In L'Arche, we learn quickly that we all need to be cared for.
Absolutely.
And we all have a capacity to care. So while we come to L'Arche often wanting to help, we realize very quickly that we often need help. So the person with an intellectual disability often has a very unique gift in their vulnerability to cut through a lot of the stuff that can separate us from each other and to get us to a place that's very real, often very fast.
Well, and it's interesting that, you know, in our society, we so often discard the gifts that people have, let alone are unable to even recognize the gifts that people have to offer. Yet at L'Arche, it seems quite the opposite, that there really is an openness that every human individual has something to offer to the community, and that it's celebrating that really gives dignity and power to everyone, regardless of their abilities or their particular character in life.
Well, you're exactly right. And this is a very central aspect of our mission, to reveal the unique and sacred value of each and every person. And you know, in our society, which is one where strength and invulnerability are often revered, we find it is a leap, kind of culturally, to learn that vulnerability can actually be a gift. And that in terms of the relationship at the level of our hearts, that's where it all begins. When we become vulnerable with each other, something happens that doesn't happen when we're strong. That's not to say strength doesn't have its place, because we learned very quickly that people with intellectual disabilities have some enormous gifts and strengths to offer to the greater culture. So this is one of the really wonderful parts of L'Arche.
Well, this is really a fascinating discussion, and we'll be able to continue it in a moment, but unfortunately we do have to stop for a short break. I'm speaking with Carl MacMillan, Community Leader of L'Arche Daybreak. We'll be right back with more on this topic. Right after this, you're watching 3D Dialogue. Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm in studio today with Carl MacMillan, Community Leader of L'Arche Daybreak. Now, in our last segment, you sort of talked about sort of how Jean Vanier started L'Arche, and that he brought two particular individuals out of an institution. And it's interesting to me to see the contrast between how society today is really becoming more dependent upon institutionalization as a way of dealing with people who are different. Yet L'Arche takes a radically different approach, almost a de-institutionalization, of returning people back to communities and really empowering them as equals rather than as ostracization or other types of the alienation that occurs through institutions. Perhaps you could elaborate on that.
Sure. L'Arche, of course, was really part of the first wave of deinstitutionalization in the mid to late 60s, and that deinstitutionalization is still occurring today. In Ontario, we are, over the next 5 years, closing down all of the remaining large institutions in the province. There are many organizations that center their work on care for people with intellectual disabilities. There are many group homes, as you know, in the greater culture. One of the real problems with deinstitutionalization has been that people have moved out of an institution, the big, ugly bricks and mortar of institutions, but while they may have a house in the community, they are not of the community.
Right.
And it is a huge difference to really live in the community and to be part of a community. So L'Arche, I think, has, with a great deal of intentionality, invited people really to the center of community life. And from our communities, we really like to interact in a very everyday way with the people on our street, the people in our town, the people in our stores and churches. So we're very integrated into the greater culture.
And it sounds also that it's very meaningful integration with the surrounding culture rather than sort of tokenistic. And I'm also interested to hear more about, I guess the word I would use is relationships among people who are fundamentally different, that sort of embracement of that difference or of the other, that really also seems to be sort of central to the mission of L'Arche, and that it's not just about bringing together people who are the same, but really cultivating that type of diversity.
Well, you know, in L'Arche, we live together in homes. It's a life-sharing concept. So in most of our homes, we have 7 to 10 people living together. And people come together. There are often a group of young people who are living with people with intellectual disabilities of various ages. And all of us are different. And home life, like home in any family, any relationship, is full of conflict. So we live together, we fight together, we learn to forgive each other. It's a very, very daily living out of the two faces of community, which Jean Vanier would say are forgiveness and celebration. So in our culture today, I would say one of the key challenges is befriending the stranger, befriending the person of difference.
Being open to them.
Being open to them. And that is not only people with intellectual disabilities, that is the person from another country, the person who has different belief systems. In our community, we have a Christian foundation, but we have people in our community who are Jewish, people who are Buddhist, people who are Muslim. How do we live together as a community of faith with all of this diversity? So we have to learn about each other. We have to listen to each other. We have to find ways to be together that honor the tradition of the other, but not melt down the traditions.
Right.
And
still respect that difference while at the same time cultivating a commonality.
And it's a huge challenge, but it's also wonderfully rich. So our community life is really a very, very vibrant place, which we realize increasingly has a message for the greater culture where all of these questions also exist concurrently.
Well, I mean, let's, perhaps end on that. I mean, what is that message to the greater culture? What can the rest of society learn from the model that L'Arche has presented, which, I mean, certainly seems quite inspiring, yet it seems that the work, not only for L'Arche, but the rest of us, is still quite a lot is out there in terms of the world learning. Is there anything that you would say that really the world could learn from in looking at L'Arche?
Fundamentally, I would say that if we can choose to dare to enter a relationship with the one who is different in our life, we have the capacity to change the world. In those single human relationships with the person who is most different from ourselves, that is a great gift for the whole culture.
Well, and it certainly speaks to a vulnerability that I think can only nurture love, rather than a defensiveness that could only nurture hate, as the opposite example. Thank you very much for joining us today. This has been a very enjoyable discussion.
Same here.
That was Carl MacMillan, leader of L'Arche Daybreak. Next, the Mahabharata, the third longest epic poem in the world. We'll be right back after this short break. You're watching 3D Dialogue.